U.S. history shouldn't feel like a luxury purchase, a guessing game, or a lecture you were never really given. If books are out of budget, you don't know where to start, or your class skipped the good parts, this channel is for you. Here, we take the stories that shaped the United States and make them clear, sourced, and human. We zoom in on people usually left out, set events in context, and show how power works without gatekeeping or jargon. No paywalls, no sponsorships, no monetization. This is a non-profit space built for learners, not ads. Every episode cites its sources and points you to ways to keep reading. From First Contact to Reconstruction, labor strikes to landmark court cases, grassroots movements to presidential decisions, we'll trace what happened, why it mattered, and who paid the price or pushed for change. If you've ever felt behind, you're not. Start anywhere. Ask questions. Disagree respectfully. Learning is the point. Subscribe, comment with what you want covered next, and share this with someone who deserves a better history class. In October 1492, the indigenous people of the Bahama Islands, the Arawaks, watched with curiosity as 3 Spanish ships anchored off their shores. Men and women, naked and full of wonder, swam out to greet the strangers, offering food, water, and gifts in a display of generous hospitality. Christopher Columbus, the leader of the Spanish expedition, recorded his first impressions of the Arawaks in terms that were both admiring and ominous. He marveled at their openness and noted that they willingly traded everything they owned. They do not bear arms. They have no iron, and he remarked on their physical strength and attractiveness. Yet Columbus's journal also revealed his intent. They would make fine servants. With 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. In that moment of first contact, the Arawaks saw visitors to welcome, while Columbus saw potential subjects to exploit. For the Arawaks, specifically the Lucayan Arawaks of the Bahamas and the Taíno Arawaks of the larger Caribbean islands, this initial encounter seemed peaceful. The Arawaks lived in village communes and had a well-developed agricultural society based on crops like cassava, maize, yams, and other staples. They had no large work animals or iron tools, but they were skilled farmers, fishers, and navigators. In their canoes they traveled between islands, and their villages could be sizable. Some Taíno towns numbered up to 2,000 to 3,000 people. Social structure among the island Arawaks was hierarchical yet communal. Each village, or cluster of villages, was led by a cacique chief who wielded both political and spiritual authority. These chiefs were often advised by shamans and governed with the consent of elders. Society was stratified, and great deference was given to the caciques, but there was no rigid, stratified nobility as in European kingdoms. The Taíno Arawaks practiced slash-and-burn agriculture, rotating their fields of cassava and maize, and they lived sustainably off the sea and land. Notably, they lacked a tradition of large-scale warfare. Various Arawak groups occasionally skirmished with one another or with their indigenous rivals. For instance, Taínos warred at times with Caribs, but such conflicts were small in scale. In fact, the Antillean Arawaks were so relatively peaceful that Carib invaders from South America had recently driven them out of the Lesser Antilles in the years just before Columbus arrived. Belief systems and cosmology were central to Arawak life. The Taíno people were polytheistic and worshipped a pantheon of nature spirits and ancestral spirits known as zemis. A zemi could refer to both a deity or spirit and the sacred object that served as its physical embodiment. These objects, often small carved idols or fetishes made of wood, stone, bone, cotton, or clay, represented spirits of fertility, weather, and ancestors. Important deities in the Taíno religion included Atabi, the mother of the waters and fertility, and her son Yukahu, spirit of cassava, the staple crop. Ancestral worship was woven into these beliefs. Many zemi idols contained relics or bones of ancestors and were believed to speak to or guide the living. Ceremonial rituals called aridos or arrieros were held to honor the zemis. During these festivals, the Taíno draped their sacred idols in cotton cloth and offered them cassava bread, while singing songs that recounted tribal history and myth. Such rituals, accompanied by music and dance, helped reinforce social bonds and shared beliefs among the Arawaks. Archaeological discoveries have underscored the richness of Arawak Taíno culture. In the heart of Puerto Rico's mountains, for example, lies the Caguana Ceremonial Ball Court Site, one of the most important pre-Columbian sites in the Caribbean. Built around 1270 CE, Caguana features some 10 to 13 stone-lined baities, ball courts or plazas where the Taíno played a sacred ball game and held rituals. Around these plazas stand carved monoliths and petroglyphs, intricate rock carvings depicting gods, animals, and ancestors. The alignment of stones at Caguana even suggests astronomical knowledge, indicating ceremonies may have been timed to celestial events. Other archaeological finds include finely crafted pottery and figurines, woven cotton hammocks, and three-pointed stone zemi-idols which early colonists and modern archaeologists have unearthed in large numbers. These triangular zemi-stones, often carved with human or animal features, may have symbolized the mountainous homeland of the gods or the shape of the cassava tuber, reflecting the spiritual importance of the staple crop. In all, the material evidence paints a picture of a people with complex religious rituals, skilled artistry, and organized community life long before European contact. It was into this world that Columbus arrived. Initially, the exchange between Spanish sailors and Arawaks was friendly. Columbus noted the Arawaks' concept of sharing and gift-giving, writing that when you ask for something they have, they never say no. To the contrary, they offer to share with anyone. This communal ethic was utterly unlike the Europeans' ethos of private property. The Arawaks' lack of familiarity with European weaponry also struck Columbus, tragically so. He observed that the islanders had no swords or guns, and even cut themselves out of ignorance when handling a Spanish sword not knowing its edge. Such innocence, to Columbus, was an opportunity. The very traits that made the Arawaks gentle and welcoming in his eyes also made them, he believed, ripe for conquest. To understand why Columbus was so intent on finding gold and slaves, one must consider the political and economic conditions in Spain at the end of the 15th century. Spain was a newly unified kingdom, born from the union of the crowns of Castile and Aragon and the culmination of the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rulers. In January 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella's armies captured Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia, completing what they saw as a divinely sanctioned crusade. This victory was followed by the expulsion of the Jews later that year and an increased persecution of any remaining non-Christians. By 1492, Spain had tied itself inseparably to the Catholic Church. The monarchy had secured from the Pope not only a marriage sanction years before, but also authorization for the Spanish Inquisition in 1478 to enforce religious uniformity. The result was a realm zealously devoted to Catholicism and flush with the militant spirit of a crusade. The conquistadors and soldiers who grew up in this era were hardened by war and animated by a sense of Christian superiority. As one historian noted, the Reconquista was a brutal conflict fueled by devotion to Christianity. The Spaniards viewed Muslims, and by extension any non-Christians, as infidels to be either converted or expelled. Crucially, they had developed the idea that fighting infidels conferred the right to enslave or exterminate those who resisted. Indeed, during the wars in Iberia, the men of Castile and Aragon learned to be tough, arrogant, undaunted by danger, and extravagant in their actions, as well as accustomed to seizing land and people as spoils of holy war. This Reconquista mindset, combining religious zeal, militarism, and the lure of material gain, would shape how the Spanish approached the peoples of the New World. By the 1480s, Spain was a nation in search of a new mission. The fall of Granada effectively ended the Holy War in Europe, and soldiers and adventurers looked for fresh opportunities. It was in this context that Christopher Columbus, a skilled navigator from Genoa, Italy, found an audience for his bold plan to reach Asia by sailing west. Several factors made Columbus's proposal attractive to the Spanish crown in 1492. First, there was a compelling economic motive. Spain's nobility and monarchs craved gold and wealth to support their state and pay for the recent costly wars. The population of Spain was mostly poor peasants, while a tiny aristocracy owned most of the land and consumed most of the resources. Gold, in the late 15th century, had become the lifeblood of emerging nation-states, a universally fungible store of value that could fund armies and purchase anything. The Spanish monarchs knew that trade with Asia, the Indies, and China promised access to spices, silks, and precious metals, but the traditional land routes to the east were now blocked. The Ottoman Turks had conquered Constantinople in 1453 and controlled the eastern Mediterranean and overland Silk Road routes. Portugal, Spain's maritime rival, was seeking a sea route to Asia around Africa. Portuguese caravels had in fact inched down the African coast and by 1488 had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, as Bartolomeu Diaz proved. If Spain did not find an alternative route, Portugal stood to dominate the rich spice trade. Thus, exploration was economically urgent for Spain. It was a high-risk, high-reward gamble to leapfrog over Portugal and find a western passage to Cathay, China, and Cipangu, Japan. There were also ideological and religious incentives driving Spain's exploration. Fresh from their victory over infidels in Iberia, Ferdinand and Isabella were eager to spread Christianity abroad. The Spanish crown portrayed the venture as a continuation of the crusading spirit, carrying the Catholic faith to pagan lands. In fact, after Columbus's voyage, the Spanish appealed to the Pope to sanction their claims in the new territories. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued the Bull Inter Caetera, which granted Spain and Portugal a separate treaty dominion over non-Christian lands in the Americas. The papal bull explicitly declared that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed, and exploited by Christian rulers, and called for the Catholic faith and Christian religion to be exalted and be everywhere increased, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. In other words, the Church gave Spain not only legal title to newly found lands, but a religious mandate to convert indigenous peoples by force if necessary. This doctrine of discovery provided moral justification, at least in European eyes, for conquest, even as it encouraged a mentality that non-European, non-Christian cultures were barbarous and ripe for domination. Columbus shrewdly navigated these currents of Spanish ambition. He had first pitched his plan to Portugal and other courts without success, but by 1492, the Spanish crown was willing to listen. Queen Isabella, especially, was intrigued by the prospect of outflanking Portugal and spreading the faith. Columbus promised them untold riches and new souls for Christianity. In the spring of 1492, he convinced Isabella and Ferdinand to sponsor him, and they signed the capitulations of Santa Fe, which granted Columbus noble titles and extraordinary rewards if he succeeded. Columbus was to be named Admiral of the Ocean Sea and Viceroy Governor of any new lands, and he would earn a 10% share of all wealth, gold, spices, etc., brought back to Spain. For the Spanish monarchs, the risk was moderate. They provided 3 ships and funding, relatively small expenses compared to a major war, but the potential payoff was enormous. Privately, some at court likely doubted Columbus would return. His calculations of the world's circumference were flawed, and experts suspected Asia was much farther away than he believed. But if he perished, the loss was minimal. If he succeeded, Spain would bask in glory and wealth. With religious fervor and royal backing, Columbus set sail in August 1492, carrying with him the expectations of a Spain hungry for gold and honor. Little did they know he would not find Asia at all, but rather a vast unknown hemisphere, one already inhabited by millions of people whose lives were about to be upended. First voyage 1492 to 1493. Columbus's first transatlantic journey forever changed the course of history. After departing Spain on August 3, 1492 with his 3 small ships, the Nina Pinta and Santa Maria, Columbus stopped in the Canary Islands for supplies and repairs, then ventured west into uncharted waters. After 5 weeks of sailing across the Atlantic, his crew sighted signs of land, birds, carved wood, and vegetation floating in the water. In the pre-dawn hours of October 12, 1492, a lookout finally spotted the pale shoreline of an island in what is now the Bahamas. Columbus came ashore, planting Spain's flag and naming the island San Salvador, though its indigenous Lucayan name was Guanahani. It was here that he first encountered the Arawak people, Lucayan Arawaks. As noted, the initial meeting was peaceful and marked by an exchange of gifts. Columbus, however, was preoccupied with finding gold, the very reason he had undertaken the voyage. The Arawaks wore small gold ornaments in their ears, which immediately caught Columbus's attention. When he inquired through signs and later interpreters where the gold came from, the Lucayans pointed south. Columbus took this as confirmation that rich sources of gold lay somewhere in the region. Eager to locate the source of the precious metal, Columbus sailed on, taking a few Arawak captives with him as guides. He explored parts of present-day Cuba, which he believed might be the Asian mainland or perhaps Japan, and then reached Hispaniola, the island of modern Haiti in the Dominican Republic. Everywhere, he asked the local inhabitants about gold. On Hispaniola, Columbus's expedition found a few bits of alluvial gold in rivers and obtained a golden mask as a gift from a Taíno cacique, which inflamed their imagination about vast gold fields somewhere in the interior. During these explorations, tensions occasionally flared. In one incident on the north coast of Hispaniola, some Spaniards demanded more bows and arrows as trade items than the local Indians were willing to give. A fight broke out, and Columbus's men ran through 2 Arawaks with swords, killing them. It was a stark omen of violence to come. In late December 1492, disaster struck when the Santa Maria ran aground on a reef off Hispaniola, with the ship beyond repair. Columbus decided to establish a small garrison outpost using its timbers. He hurriedly built a fort, which he named La Navidad because it was around Christmas, and left behind 39 crew members there. These men were to search for gold and hold the territory until Columbus could return on a second voyage. In January 1493, Columbus set sail for Spain aboard the Nina and Pinta, carrying with him a few Arawak captives and samples of New World curiosities, parrots, plants, a little gold as proof of his discovery. During the long homeward voyage, conditions were harsh for the indigenous captives. In the cold weather, many fell ill and died before reaching Europe. Nevertheless, Columbus's arrival back in Spain in March 1493 was greeted with fanfare. He presented King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella with colorful, if exaggerated, accounts of the lands he had found. In his official report to the court, Columbus insisted that he had reached islands just off the coast of Asia, perhaps near Japan or China. He described Hispaniola as a paradise of fertile land and flowing rivers, declaring falsely that there are many wide rivers of which the majority contain gold, and that the native people were simple and yielding. He even promised that, given a little support, he could deliver as much gold as they need, and as many slaves as they ask in the coming voyage. Such grandiose claims, mixing fact with fiction, dazzled the Spanish crown. Columbus was hailed as an admiral and hero who had opened the door to Cathay, even though he had actually found a completely unknown continent. Isabella and Ferdinand promptly agreed to fund a much larger expedition for Columbus to return to the Indies and reap the rewards. Second voyage, 1493 to 1496. Columbus's second voyage was a massive enterprise of colonization and conquest. In September 1493, just 6 months after his return, Columbus set sail again, this time with 17 ships and over 1,200 men, including soldiers, settlers, priests, and provisions for establishing colonies. The aim was explicit: to retrieve the promised gold and to acquire slaves and converts to Christianity. Upon arriving in the Caribbean, Columbus and his fleet visited several islands, discovering others like Dominica and Guadeloupe, then made haste back to Hispaniola to check on the fate of Fort Navidad. What he found ashore was alarming. The fort was in ruins, and all 39 Spaniards he had left were dead. It emerged that the men of Navidad had grossly abused the hospitality of the Arawaks. They had roamed the island in armed gangs seeking gold, raping native women, and taking children as slaves, until the outraged islanders fought back and killed the intruders. Far from chastening Columbus and his new expedition, this incident set the stage for a harsher clash. Columbus established a new settlement on Hispaniola, which he named La Isabela, and vowed to subdue the island, with thousands of Spanish colonists now encamped on Hispaniola and still no gold mines in sight. Columbus felt pressure to deliver tangible profits. He instituted a regime of slavery and forced labor to meet Spain's expectations. In 1494 to 1495, he and his men embarked on raids to capture indigenous people as slaves. One particularly notorious slave raid in 1495 rounded up some 1,500 Taíno Arawak men, women, and children from villages across Hispaniola. The captives were driven into pens guarded by Spaniards with dogs, and then Columbus selected the best 500 individuals to be shipped to Europe as slaves. The rest were either released or escaped, often to die in hiding. About 200 of the 500 captives died en route to Spain. The survivors were put up for sale in Seville by Columbus's agents, with the church's blessing. The archdeacon of the town handling the auction noted the enslaved islanders showed no more embarrassment than animals at being naked on the block. Columbus wrote to the sovereigns that let us in the name of the Holy Trinity go on sending all the slaves that can be sold, indicating his intention to continue the human trade. This was the first transatlantic shipment of American Indians, inaugurating a brutal traffic in human lives. However, even slavery did not immediately yield the riches Columbus had promised, because Queen Isabella herself had qualms about enslaving her new subjects. When Columbus sent an initial batch of enslaved Arawaks to Spain, Isabella was reportedly horrified. She viewed the indigenous people as potential Spanish subjects who should become tax-paying vassals after conversion, rather than chattel to be owned. Upon receiving 500 enslaved people as Columbus's gift, the Queen sternly ordered that they be freed and returned home, asserting that the people of the Indies were under the Crown's protection. This royal repugnance to outright slavery, at least in those early years, forced Columbus to seek a different way to amass wealth from the islands, primarily to somehow obtain gold. Frustrated in finding the rumored gold fields, Columbus imposed a brutal tribute system on the Taínos of Hispaniola. In the mineral-poor regions under Spanish control, Columbus's regime required every adult native to deliver a regular quota of gold dust, or where gold was scarce, a quota of spun cotton to the Spaniards. Each Taíno who paid their tribute was given a token, a copper coin or badge, to hang around their neck as proof. Any person found without a copper token after the tribute deadline had their hands cut off and was left to bleed to death as an example. This policy was horrifyingly cruel and impossible to fulfill. Columbus had vastly overestimated Hispaniola's gold resources. Apart from a few small river deposits, there were no rich mines to exploit. Desperate to satisfy the invaders' demands, the Arawaks scoured stream beds for every grain of gold they could find, but it was never enough. Facing punishment, many Arawaks tried to flee. Men, women, and children abandoned their villages and fled into the mountains, hoping to hide from the Spanish. Columbus responded by sending armed raids to hunt them down with dogs. Arawak fugitives were chased, torn apart by ferocious dogs, or killed on sight if captured. By 1495 to 1496, the impact of these policies was devastating the native population of Hispaniola. Bartolomé de las Casas, a young Spanish priest who lived on the island, and would later become famous as a defender of indigenous rights, recorded that the Arawaks began to resist and also to despair. Some groups mounted armed uprisings against the Spaniards, but the Europeans, with their steel swords, crossbows, and horses, easily prevailed over wooden spears and stone axes. When rebels were caught, the Spanish hanged or burned them alive as a warning. Equally tragic were the spontaneous acts of defiance born of hopelessness. Mass suicides occurred in some communities, with Taíno parents poisoning themselves and even their infants with cassava juice rather than submit to slavery. Las Casas somberly noted that some mothers killed their babies to spare them from the torment that awaited under the Spaniards. Within 2 years of Columbus's return, the hardships of war, forced labor, violence, and famine had killed perhaps half of the 250,000 Indians Las Casas estimated lived on Hispaniola. Modern historians debate pre-contact numbers, with some estimates lower and others far higher, but all sources agree on the precipitous decline. By 1496, starvation and disease, smallpox and measles would soon follow, though these may have appeared slightly later, were also taking a toll on a population weakened by exploitation. Columbus himself, facing the utter failure of his promises of vast gold, began to lose standing. He decided to return to Spain in 1496 to report on his colony status and to beg for more support, leaving his brothers Bartholomew and Diego Columbus in charge in Hispaniola. The colony, now centered at the new city of Isabella, was fracturing. Factions of disgruntled Spanish settlers mutinied against Columbus's family due to hunger, disease, and disgust at his harsh rule. The once friendly Taíno caciques, such as Kenabo in the interior, had turned hostile. Kenabo allegedly led a valiant guerrilla resistance until he was captured by trickery. Columbus's men seized him during a parley and shipped him off in chains. He died en route to Spain. By the time Columbus left Hispaniola after the second voyage, a pattern of conquest, enslavement, and violence was well established. Of the estimated several 100,000 Taínos originally on the island, only tens of thousands remained alive by the late 1490s. Columbus's regime had already set in motion what one Harvard historian later bluntly called complete genocide of the indigenous people. Third voyage, 1498 to 1500. After 2 difficult voyages, Columbus's third expedition further unraveled his grand dreams. In 1498, Columbus sailed with a smaller fleet of 6 ships on a more southerly route across the Atlantic. This time, he became the first European of his era to glimpse the South American mainland. In August 1498, he landed on the shores of today's Venezuela, near the Orinoco Delta in Trinidad. The enormous flow of fresh water from the Orinoco River led Columbus to suspect that he had found not just an island, but a mainland of a truly vast landmass, perhaps even the earthly paradise of legend. He still thought it might be a far extremity of Asia. Collecting some pearls from the local people on the coast, Columbus then sailed northward back to Hispaniola. When Columbus arrived at Hispaniola in 1498, he found the colony in chaos. During his absence, his brothers had proved inept and often cruel governors. The remaining Taíno population had largely refused to cooperate further, and Spanish settlers were in open revolt over Columbus's leadership and the desperate condition of the colony. Hunger and disease stalked the Spanish as well, and many accused Columbus of misleading them about the prosperity of the Indies. Columbus attempted to restore order with a heavy hand. According to accounts, he hanged rebel colonists and intensified the oppression of the natives to assert control. Reports of Columbus's mismanagement and of atrocities being committed made their way back to Spain by dissatisfied settlers and priests. The Spanish crown, growing concerned that the Columbus brothers were jeopardizing the enterprise, decided to take action. In 1500, the Spanish sovereigns dispatched a royal commissioner, Francisco de Bobadilla, to investigate the situation in Hispaniola. Bobadilla arrived to find that Columbus had brutally quashed a Spanish mutiny and had several Spanish nobles awaiting execution. Appalled and armed with royal authority, Bobadilla relieved Columbus of his command. The once proud admiral of the ocean sea was arrested, clapped in irons, and put on a ship back to Spain along with his brothers. This ignominious fall from power was a turning point. In Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella ordered Columbus freed from chains upon his arrival. They likely never intended him to be literally shackled, and they heard his pleas. Columbus was eventually cleared of the most serious charges. He was able to defend some of his actions or blame subordinates, but the crown stripped him of his governorship of the Indies. Never again would Columbus be entrusted to rule territories. The Spanish crown resolved to appoint its own direct governors to new lands. The age of Columbus's personal rule was over, even though his name would forever be linked to these territories. Fourth voyage, 1502 to 1504. Despite his disgrace, Columbus was still respected as an explorer, and he desperately wanted to regain his prestige. In 1502, he persuaded King Ferdinand to fund one last voyage, framing it as an attempt to finally find a western passage to Asia, perhaps a strait beyond the islands, and to discover more riches. Now about 50 years old, Columbus set sail with 4 small caravels, notably without the title of governor, as a mere admiral. The fourth voyage proved to be the most arduous. Columbus was denied permission to land at the new colony of Santo Domingo, Hispaniola's new capital under Governor Nicolas de Ovando, as a hurricane was approaching. Columbus's ships rode out the storm, but a convoy of Spanish treasure ships, ironically, one carrying some of Columbus's chief political enemies and much New World gold, sailed straight into the hurricane and sank, a twist of fate that vindicated Columbus's seamanship if not his reputation. Columbus then explored the coast of Central America, sailing along Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama. Here he encountered different indigenous cultures, likely Mayan traders in large canoes off Yucatan, and various groups along the isthmus. He was thrilled by traces of gold in Panama's rivers, and by reports from indigenous contacts of another ocean just beyond. Indeed, the Pacific was a short trek away, though Columbus never saw it. Still obsessed with finding a route to the Indies, Columbus scoured the coastline for a strait but found none. Misfortune compounded. 2 of his ships became worm-infested and unseaworthy, and in 1503 Columbus was forced to abandon them on the shore of Jamaica. With only 2 ships left, Columbus's diminished crew could not carry everyone. so a detachment was sent in canoes to seek rescue in Hispaniola. Columbus and his men remained stranded on Jamaica for a year, suffering through hunger and mutiny. In a famous episode of ingenuity, Columbus used his knowledge of an upcoming lunar eclipse to frighten the local Jamaican Arawaks into continuing to provision his men. He warned that the Christian god would show displeasure by making the moon disappear, and when the eclipse darkened the night sky as predicted, the islanders were awed and agreed to help him. Columbus then relented and the moon returned. Eventually, in June 1504, rescue ships from Hispaniola arrived and took Columbus back to Spain. Columbus never sailed again. He was aging, in poor health, and out of favor at court. He spent his final years pressing the crown to honor the original contract that promised him 10% of all New World wealth and the restoration of his titles. He died in 1506, still believing, at least officially, that his voyages had reached the outskirts of Asia. In reality, others had already begun to recognize that Columbus had stumbled upon continents previously unknown to Europeans. The Florentine explorer, Amerigo Vespucci, voyaged to South America in the early 1500s and concluded, "This was a new world, mundus novus." His published letters were widely read, and cartographers soon after named the new continents America in Vespucci's honor. Meanwhile, the Spanish crown continued colonization without Columbus. Governors like Ovando on Hispaniola and later conquistadores would take over the work of empire building. The outcomes of Columbus's voyages were monumental and grim. By Columbus's last trip, the destruction of the Arawaks of the Caribbean was well underway. The Spanish introduced encomienda, a system akin to feudal serfdom, in which surviving natives were apportioned to Spanish settlers to serve as forced laborers in farms, mines, and households. The conditions were lethal. Las Casas, who by this time had become an outspoken critic of Spanish cruelty, estimated that by 1508 only about 60,000 natives were left in all of Hispaniola, down from hundreds of thousands in 1492. By 1515, perhaps 50,000 Taíno remained. By 1542, a mere 200 were counted. By the 1550s, the Indios of the island had effectively been declared extinct in Spanish records. While a few mixed-race descendants survived and Taíno bloodlines continued through the people, the distinct Arawak cultures of the Bahamas and Greater Antilles were effectively destroyed within 2 generations of Columbus's landing. A report from 1650 lamented that none of the original Arawaks or their descendants could be found on Hispaniola. The Caribbean, so densely populated when Columbus arrived, became known as a graveyard for its native peoples. This catastrophic decline was due not only to diseases like smallpox, influenza, and measles to which islanders had no immunity, but also very directly to violence, overwork, and starvation imposed by the Europeans. Columbus's own son Diego Columbus, who became governor of Hispaniola after 1509, presided over a colony where African slaves began to be imported to replace the dying Indians, the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade in human beings from Africa to the Americas. Columbus's expeditions, despite their personal tragedies and failures, opened the floodgates of European exploration. Spain's response evolved over the 4 voyages from initial enthusiasm to sober second thought. After the first voyage, the Spanish crown was elated. They heaped honors on Columbus and raced to secure their claims, hence the papal bull and the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, dividing the non-European world with Portugal. After the second voyage, however, the relative lack of gold and the reports of disorder tempered the royal attitude. Columbus's requests for more support met with scrutiny. By the third voyage, when Columbus was sent home in chains, Ferdinand and Isabella had effectively decided that Columbus was a brilliant navigator, but a poor governor. They removed him to assert greater direct royal control. By the fourth voyage, the crown's support was lukewarm. Columbus was permitted to sail, but explicitly forbidden from stopping at Hispaniola, and he carried a sense that he was undertaking a private venture under royal license, not leading a state enterprise. Still, Ferdinand, after Columbus's death, did allow Columbus's son to inherit the title of admiral and even govern Hispaniola for a time, as partial compensation according to the original contract. In the long run, however, the Spanish monarchy marginalized Columbus's heirs and put power into the hands of appointed colonial officials. Columbus had initiated Spain's overseas empire, but the empire quickly grew beyond him. Within 15 years of his death, Spain would find the vast riches Columbus never did, not in Asia, but in the Americas themselves, through the conquests of the Aztec and Inca empires. Columbus's voyages thus had a legacy he never anticipated. They started the continuous European presence in the New World and ushered in an era of aggressive imperial expansion. The tragic fate that befell the Arawaks under Columbus was not an isolated episode. It proved to be the opening chapter in a broader saga of European conquest in the Americas. In the decades and centuries after 1492, other indigenous peoples across the hemisphere would suffer similar violence, dispossession, and devastation. As historian Howard Zinn poignantly observed, what Columbus did to the Arawaks of the Bahamas, Cortés did to the Aztecs of Mexico, Pizarro to the Incas of Peru, and the English settlers of Virginia and Massachusetts to the Powhatans and the Pequots. In each case, the pattern resembled that set by Columbus. Explorers and conquerors arrived with a lust for gold, slaves, and land. They encountered native civilizations initially hospitable or diplomatically amenable, and through a combination of deception, superior weaponry, and sheer ruthlessness, they subdued or destroyed those peoples. The methods of Columbus, seizing host sages, demanding tribute, inflicting terror on non-combatants, echoed in the conquests of Mesoamerica and North America that followed. The Aztec Empire, Mexico. In 1519, a Spanish adventurer named Hernán Cortés landed on the Gulf Coast of Mexico leading a small expedition of about 600 men. He came, like Columbus, with official blessings. His expedition was financed by Spanish colonists in Cuba and sanctioned by the governor, and with one obsessive goal: find gold. At that time, the Aztec civilization dominated central Mexico. The Aztecs, heirs to the rich cultures of the Maya, Zapotec, and others, had built a magnificent island capital at Tenochtitlan, where Mexico City stands today, and ruled over millions of subjects. They were a formidable military society, yet their initial encounter with the Spaniards was colored by religious prophecy and curiosity. Aztec Emperor Montezuma II was informed of the arrival of pale, bearded strangers riding deer horses and firing thunderous weapons. In Aztec lore, the god king Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent deity, had once departed to the east, promising to return in a CE cattle year of the Aztec calendar, which coincidentally was 1519. Montezuma wondered if Cortés might be this returning god, or at least some divine envoy. Uncertain and hoping to avert conflict, Montezuma sent Cortés lavish gifts of gold and silver, and politely urged the foreigners to leave. These gifts, however, had the opposite effect. They inflamed the Spaniards' greed. As the painter Albrecht Dürer later marveled upon seeing the loot Cortés sent back to Spain, a sun of gold, a moon of silver, and other treasures proved the wealth of the land. Cortés proceeded with a calculated strategy of conquest by terror and alliance. Recognizing that the Aztecs had many enemies among subjugated tribes, he forged alliances, most importantly with the Tlaxcalans, a neighboring people independent of Aztec rule, and other discontented vassals. Armed with these native allies, Cortés advanced inland. He also demonstrated a cold-blooded flair for psychological warfare. In the city of Cholula, which was aligned with the Aztecs, Cortés orchestrated a notorious massacre. Feigning diplomacy, he invited Cholula's leading nobles and warriors to a peaceful gathering in the town square. Once they were assembled, Cortés's troops sealed off the exits and, at a signal, opened fire with cannons and crossbows and charged on horseback into the unarmed crowd. The result was an indiscriminate slaughter. Thousands of men, and by some accounts women and children too, were cut down in mere hours. The massacre of Cholula was designed to paralyze the will of the population by a sudden, frightful deed, as Zinn recounts. It succeeded. News of the Spaniards' treachery and brutality spread, sowing fear among other native cities. By the time Cortés reached Tenochtitlan, Montezuma was psychologically disarmed and received the Spaniards as guests in November 1519. Within the next 2 years, the Spanish and their allies overturned the Aztec Empire. Cortés took Montezuma hostage in his own palace, hoping to rule through him. Eventually, conflict erupted in the city. Montezuma was killed. Accounts differ on whether the Spaniards murdered him or he was slain by his own angry people, and the Spaniards had to fight their way out on the Night of Sorrows in 1520 with heavy losses. But Cortés regrouped, and with reinforcements and a smallpox epidemic ravaging Tenochtitlan's population, he laid siege to the Aztec capital. In August 1521, after a brutal street-by-street battle, the city fell. Tenochtitlan was devastated. By one Spanish estimate, over 100,000 Aztecs died in the siege and assault. The Aztec temples were defiled, and their empire was claimed for Spain. As Zinn succinctly puts it, when their cavalcade of murder was over, they were in Mexico City, Montezuma was dead, and the Aztec civilization shattered was in the hands of the Spaniards. The treasure of the Aztecs, gold and silver artifacts, gems and valuables, was seized, melted down, or sent to Europe. What Columbus had begun with a few islands, Cortés extended to a wealthy continental civilization, using the same blend of deceit, violence, and exploitation of native divisions. The Aztecs, like the Arawaks, also suffered a precipitous population collapse. Within a generation or two, after the conquest, disease and colonial abuses had reduced the indigenous population of central Mexico by millions. The Inca Empire, Peru. Not long after the Aztec collapse, the Spanish turned their ambitions to the towering Andes of South America, where the Inca Empire reigned. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro, a Spanish conquistador inspired by Cortés's success, led a tiny force around 180 men into the Inca realm, which was already weakened by civil war. The Inca Empire was larger than Aztec domain, stretching from Ecuador to Chile with sophisticated agriculture, roads, and state organization. Pizarro employed the same tactics of duplicity and terror. He invited the Inca Emperor Atahualpa to a friendly meeting in the town of Cajamarca, then sprang a trap. With a surprise attack, Pizarro's heavily armed men, wielding cannon, guns, and cavalry, massacred thousands of unarmed Inca attendants in the plaza and seized Atahualpa as a prisoner. Although vastly outnumbered by the Inca host, the Spaniards' sudden onslaught and superior weapons wrought chaos. The capture of Atahualpa paralyzed the Inca leadership. Pizarro then extracted a legendary ransom. Atahualpa offered to fill an entire large room with gold and twice over with silver as payment for his release. The Incas delivered an astonishing amount, roughly 24 tons of gold and silver, which the Spaniards promptly melted down into ingots. Despite receiving this richest ransom in history, Pizarro betrayed his promise and executed Atahualpa in 1533, under pretext of heresy and other trumped-up charges. The decapitation of the Inca leadership, combined with the Spaniards' alliance with some disgruntled Inca factions, led to the rapid fall of the empire. Pizarro's forces marched into the Inca capital Cusco and occupied it, seizing palaces and temples. In the following years, the Spanish fought remaining Inca resistance. There were indigenous rebellions and a neo-Inca state that lasted until 1572 in Vilcabamba, but effectively the Inca Empire was destroyed as a political entity by the mid-1530s. The enormous wealth of the Andes, especially the silver mines of Potosi and other locations, soon began flowing to Spain. Pizarro's conquest, like Cortés's, was fueled by what Zinn describes as the frenzy of the early capitalist states of Europe for gold, for slaves, for products of the soil. The ruthlessness of these conquests cannot be overstated. Spanish accounts themselves tell of the terror tactics: whole villages burned, nobles garroted or fed to dogs, and endless plunder. The pattern established by Columbus in the Caribbean, violence in the service of wealth accumulation, repeated on a larger scale in Mexico and Peru. Indeed, the plunder of the Aztecs and Incas helped finance Spain's rise as the richest and most powerful kingdom in Europe in the 16th century and, as some scholars argue, also jump-started the engines of early modern capitalism in Europe. The human cost for indigenous Americans, however, was catastrophic. Old World diseases, smallpox, influenza, typhus ripped through the Inca and Aztec populations during and after the conquests, killing countless people who might never have seen a Spaniard. Combined with warfare and forced labor, such as the encomienda and later repartimiento systems that Pizarro and his successors imposed, this led to the near collapse of native populations. The Inca population of the Andes, like the Aztecs of Mesoamerica, declined by well over half in the decades after conquest. North America, Powhatans of Virginia. The methods of Columbus and the conquistadors were not confined to the Spanish. Other European colonizers, though arriving later and often with different aims, settlement rather than outright plunder, engaged in analogous strategies of indigenous dispossession and violence. In 1607, over a century after Columbus, the English established their first permanent colony in North America at Jamestown, Virginia, right in the heart of the powerful Powhatan Confederacy. Initially, relations between the English settlers and the Algonquian-speaking Powhatan people were wary but not hostile. The Confederacy's leader, Chief Wahunsinica, known to the English as Powhatan, oversaw about 30 tribes in the region. He cautiously allowed the strangers to settle, perhaps seeing potential allies or at least hoping to contain them. The Native Americans even saved the Jamestown colonists during the terrible starving time of 1609 to 1610 by trading them food. According to English accounts, some colonists ran off to live with the natives who had plenty to eat rather than starve in the fort. However, the English showed the same pattern of ingratitude and aggression. When Powhatan politely refused English demands to return runaway colonists in 1610, responding with proud and disdainful answers, as one English report put it, the English governor decided on punishment. He sent soldiers to attack a Powhatan village under the guise of peace. The English invited the village leaders to talks, then suddenly fell upon the community, killing 15 to 16 people, burning the houses and crops, and even kidnapping the Powhatan queen and her children. In a chilling act of cruelty, the English raiders threw the queen's children overboard from a boat and shot out their brains in the water, then stabbed the queen to death. This treacherous massacre mirrored Cortés's tactic at Cholula, a deliberate terror attack on non-combatants to send a message. After this incident, full-scale conflict was only a matter of time. In 1622, Chief Powhatan's brother and successor Opechancanough led a coordinated uprising against the encroaching colonists who had been relentlessly expanding and seizing native lands. On March 22, 1622, the Powhatan warriors attacked settlements up and down the James River, killing 347 colonists, about a quarter of Virginia's European population, in a single day. This assault, though nearly wiping out Jamestown, it failed to capture the fort itself, provoked shock and panic among the English, but also served as a convenient rationale for what many colonists already wanted, the extermination of the Powhatans. From then on, the English waged what can only be described as a war of annihilation. The Virginia Company in London declared that a perpetual war without peace or truce would now be pursued to destroy the Powhatans. The English colonists, unable to easily find or defeat the Powhatan fighters in open battle, who could fade into forests and employ guerrilla tactics, adopted a strategy strikingly similar to earlier conquistadors and chillingly prophetic of modern total war. They feigned friendship and lured the Powhatans into a false sense of security over the next few years. Then, when the natives had planted their corn and were preparing for harvest, the English launched sudden attacks to burn villages and crops. According to one historian, the English concluded that if they couldn't track down every last warrior, they would instead destroy the bases of sustenance and terrorize the whole population. Captain John Smith, who had known Powhatan and whose life, according to legend, was saved by Powhatan's daughter Pocahontas in 1607, was no longer in Virginia, but others carried out a brutal cycle of violence. Within a few years, the English claimed to have exacted revenge many times over for the 1622 massacre. By 1644, after a second uprising led by the aging Opechancanough, who was captured and summarily executed, the Powhatan Confederacy was effectively broken. The surviving Powhatan peoples were forced onto the first Indian reservations in the Americas or assimilated under English dominion. The English justification for such genocidal tactics echoed the logic of Columbus and Cortés. They cast the Indians as impediments to God's plan and their own survival. As one contemporary observed, the colonists reasoned that the Indians' way of war had no limit of scruple or mercy, hence the English need show no mercy in return, and furthermore, that no treaty with savages needed to be honored if it conflicted with English advantage. This asymmetry of intent The English, determined not to share the land but to possess it outright, meant that coexistence gave way to exterminationism. Francis Jennings, an ethnohistorian, noted that the Virginia settlers taught local tribes 3 key lessons. 1. The English would break even the most solemn promises whenever it suited them. 2. The English way of war knew no limits and did not spare women, children, or the innocent. And 3. Native weapons were largely ineffective against European guns and steel. These bitter lessons would be learned again and again by indigenous peoples facing colonial powers. The Pequot War, New England. Across the Atlantic seaboard, another English colony would demonstrate the same lethal pattern a generation later. In 1630, Puritan settlers founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Unlike the Virginians, who initially sought gold and then turned to tobacco farming, the Puritans came seeking to build a new society, a city upon a hill, yet they too soon came into conflict with the original inhabitants. In southern New England, the Pequot tribe controlled lucrative fur and wampum trade networks. Tensions between the Pequots and English, as well as other coastal tribes allied with the English, like the Narragansett and Mohegan, culminated in the Pequot War of 1636 to 1637. The Puritan colonists coveted the Pequots' land and were eager to eliminate a powerful native nation that stood in the way of their expansion. The flashpoint was the killing of an English trader, which the colonists blamed on the Pequots, providing a handy pretext for war. New England's Puritan leaders proceeded to sanction a war of conquest, even deploying religious rhetoric to justify it. As Massachusetts Governor John Winthrop argued, the Pequot lands were legally a vacuum because the natives had not subdued or cultivated the land in the English manner. Thus they had only a natural right, not a civil right, to it. By this reasoning, the English claimed the area was theirs for the taking. Moreover, Puritan clergymen cited biblical passages such as Psalm 2:8, "Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance," to frame the war as God ordained, and Romans 13 to urge obedience to their cause and damnation for those, the Indians, who resisted. In 1637, the English and their native allies launched a decisive strike against the Pequots that has gone down in history for its brutality, the Mystic Massacre. Under commanders John Mason and John Underhill, a force of Connecticut and Massachusetts colonists accompanied by Narragansett and Mohegan warriors surrounded a major Pequot village on the Mystic River in present-day Connecticut just before dawn on May 26, 1637. They set the village's wigwams on fire, encircling it so no one could escape. As flames engulfed the settlement, those Pequot who tried to flee, men, women, and children, were shot or cut down by swords. The English had resolved that battle is only one of the ways to destroy an enemy's will. Massacre can accomplish the same end with less risk, as one account summarized Mason's strategy. In a matter of hours, the Pequot village was obliterated. Hundreds of Pequot people, estimates range from 400 to as many as 700, mostly non-combatants, were killed. One of the colonists, William Bradford of Plymouth, described the scene with a mix of horror and triumph. Those that escaped the fire were slain with the sword, some hewed to pieces, others run through with their rapiers. It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire and the streams of blood. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they, the English, gave the praise thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them. In Bradford's chilling account, even the stink and scent of burning human bodies could be sanctified as a sweet sacrifice to God's will. The few Pequot survivors of the Mystic Massacre were hunted down in subsequent months. Some were captured and sold into slavery, shipped to the West Indies, or forced to serve English households. Others escaped to live with sympathetic tribes. The English, determined to erase the Pequot as a distinct entity, even banned the name Pequot under penalty of death. By the war's end, the Pequot were virtually annihilated as a people. An English report in 1638 declared the Pequot nation dissolved. Remarkably, a tiny remnant persisted and Pequot descendants survive today, but for over 3 centuries the tribe had officially ceased to exist in colonial eyes. A modern historian noted that a 1970s count found only 21 individuals in Connecticut who could trace lineage to the Pequot, a startling testament to how close to total the genocide was. Puritan leaders showed little remorse. Celebrated divine Cotton Mather later extolled the carnage by saying 600 Pequot souls were sent down to hell that day, framing the slaughter as just punishment and divine triumph. The Pequot War taught other indigenous peoples in New England the high cost of resisting colonial expansion. It also established a brutal precedent of total war against Native Americans in New England, a precedent that would be followed in King Philip's War, 1675 to 1676, a generation later, when Puritan colonies again fought to seize Indian lands with similar ferocity, resulting in thousands more native deaths and the decimation of several tribes. From the Caribbean to the Great Plains, the playbook of conquest often repeated these themes: use of divide and conquer tactics, allying with some tribes against others, appearances of friendship betrayed by sudden violence, deliberate attacks on villages and food supplies to starve the resistance, religious or racial justifications for unrestrained killing, and the enslavement or mass displacement of survivors. The echo of Columbus's methods resonated in each frontier. Settlers initially greeted with generosity eventually decided, as one Virginia colonist put it, that they could not subdue the Indians with kindness, and so must do so by force. This mindset led to centuries of wars, from the Powhatans and Pequots in the 1600s to the Shawnee, Cherokee, Sioux, Apache, and countless others in later years, in which indigenous nations were consistently pushed to the brink. As one summary of colonial America notes, by the end of the Indian Wars in the late 19th century, the native population in lands that would become the United States had fallen by an estimated 90% or more from pre-contact times. Columbus's inaugural collision in 1492 had set in motion an avalanche of imperial violence that spanned the Americas, justified by notions of European civilization and progress destined to supplant indigenous savagery, legacy, memory, and education, reframing Columbus in history. More than 5 centuries after Columbus's landfall, the world is still grappling with how to remember and teach this history. For a long time, the predominant narrative in Western education cast Christopher Columbus as a bold, heroic explorer, the intrepid discoverer of America, and glossed over the perspectives of the Arawaks and other indigenous peoples who suffered in the aftermath. In the United States and Europe alike, Columbus was enshrined in textbooks, public monuments, and holidays, often with scant mention of the darker side of his voyages. However, in recent decades, particularly since the quincentennial of 1992, there has been a powerful movement to re-examine and reframe Columbus's legacy through a more critical and inclusive lens. Native American scholars, activists, and many educators have worked to bring the voices of indigenous peoples into the narrative, challenging the traditional glorification of Columbus and highlighting the consequences of his discovery for the original inhabitants of the Americas. In U.S. schools up through much of the 20th century, lessons about Columbus were celebratory and simplistic. Generations of American children learned the sing-song rhyme. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Textbooks portrayed Columbus as a brave, persevering visionary who proved the earth was round, a myth. Educated Europeans already knew the earth was round. Columbus's unique claim was that it was small enough to reach Asia by sailing west. The indigenous people he met were often depicted as passive figures who helped or hindered Columbus rather than as nations with agency and rights. Importantly, textbooks largely omitted the brutal atrocities that Columbus and the Spanish committed. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison, one of Columbus's foremost biographers, did acknowledge the cruel policy of slavery and genocide initiated by Columbus, but he tucked this admission deep within his narrative. In Morison's popular mid-20th century biography Christopher Columbus, Mariner, he devoted a few paragraphs to the destruction of the Arawaks, even using the word genocide, only to conclude in the final pages that Columbus's defects were outweighed by his qualities, and that his seamanship was his most essential trait. Morison's approach, briefly noting the dark side and then moving on to a triumphant conclusion, exemplified how Columbus was taught for decades. Any negative facts were mentioned quickly and then buried in a mass of other information so that students would not dwell on them as central to the story. The result, as Zinn argued, was a kind of ideological whitewashing. By downplaying genocide as a footnote to a grand saga of discovery, traditional histories implicitly suggested that such atrocities were an unfortunate but minor price for human progress. This progress narrative took Western civilization's expansion as a given good and marginalized the suffering of indigenous peoples. By the late 20th century, however, social movements and new scholarship began to chip away at this one-sided narrative. The civil rights era and the rise of multicultural awareness in the 1960s to 1970s prompted questions about why American history glossed over unpleasant truths. Native American activism, such as the occupation of Alcatraz in 1969 and the rise of groups like the American Indian Movement, also brought attention to the historical treatment of indigenous peoples. Historians like D. Brown, with Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee 1970, and Vine Deloria Jr., with Custer Died for Your Sins 1960, made the case that American history needed to reckon with the conquest of native nations. But it was around the 1992 quincentenary of Columbus's voyage that the debate truly entered public consciousness worldwide. In the lead-up to 1992, a deluge of scholarship and commentary revisited Columbus's impact. Books like Kirkpatrick Sale's The Conquest of Paradise 1990 and Howard Zinn's own work, Zinn's chapter on Columbus in A People's History of the U.S., originally published 1980, was widely read by the 1990s, unabashedly labeled Columbus's actions as genocidal and raised the question of moral accountability. As one article noted, Columbus's public perception really fell under question with the 1980 publication of Howard Zinn's A People's History, which described the arrival of Columbus as a genocide. Native American voices were at the forefront of reframing the legacy. Indigenous scholars and leaders argued that for Native peoples, the arrival of Columbus was not a discovery but the beginning of invasion and colonization. In 1990, representatives of Native nations from across the Americas gathered in Quito, Ecuador for a conference pointedly titled 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance. They and others declared 1992 not a celebration, but a time of mourning and reflection on 5 centuries of survival since Columbus. In the United States, protests were planned for Columbus Day 1992. Petitions circulated to remove Columbus statues or to commemorate the indigenous victims of colonialism. As Suzanne Shonharjo Cheyenne and Hodogi Muskogee, a Native American activist, put it in 1991, what we're trying to do is speak to as many teachers as possible and basically tell them to stop lying to little kids in schools about the discovery of the New World. Native advocates pushed educators to teach that someone was already here, a phrase that began to supplement the old 1492 rhyme, and that Columbus didn't discover a new world so much as violently disrupt 2 already old worlds, bringing them into collision. Under this pressure and amidst scholarly change, educational organizations responded. The National Council for the Social Studies, NCSS, in 1991, issued guidelines urging teachers to convey the basic facts of Columbus's voyages, while incorporating recent scholarship and conveying the unfolding impact of the voyage. In practice, this meant including frank discussion of the diverse and advanced Indian societies in 1492 and the devastating impact of European arrival on them. More than 30 other groups, from the American Indian Heritage Foundation to church councils, endorsed these calls for a more honest curriculum. Resolutions were passed, for instance, by the National Education Association to promote alternative analyses of Columbus's landing that highlighted treatment of native populations. The National Council of Churches declared the quincentenary a time of repentance, noting that what was freedom and opportunity for Europeans had been oppression, degradation, and genocide for Native Americans. Even libraries and the NEH jumped in, funding programs and documentaries to broaden public understanding. Teachers began changing their language. Some chose to commemorate rather than celebrate Columbus Day, and to describe it as an encounter between worlds rather than a one-sided discovery. Textbooks, albeit slowly, started to improve. By the early 2000s, many textbooks no longer repeated the Columbus proved the world was round myth, and some included paragraphs on the cruel treatment of the Arawaks or the decimation of the Taíno. Still, activists noted textbooks often remained timid. Some simply skipped Columbus altogether to avoid controversy, or still framed him under headings like brave explorers without providing multiple perspectives. As one education expert observed, A truly balanced account requires giving voice to the people who met Columbus as well as those who sent him. Perhaps the most visible aspect of reevaluation has been the public debate over Columbus Day. Since 1937, the United States has celebrated Columbus Day as a federal holiday every second Monday of October, originally observed on October 12. It was promoted by Italian-American groups, notably the Knights of Columbus, as a celebration of Italian heritage and of the supposed founding of the Americas by Europeans. But Native Americans have long viewed Columbus Day as painful. Starting in the late 20th century and accelerating in the 2010s, many states and municipalities have renamed Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, or a variant, such as Native American Day. South Dakota was an early adopter, designating Native Americans Day in place of Columbus Day back in 1990. Since then, states like Alaska, Minnesota, Vermont, Maine, New Mexico, Oregon, and others have officially replaced or dual-named the holiday as Indigenous Peoples Day. As of 2023, only 16 U.S. states still observe an official holiday named exclusively Columbus Day, while 17 others plus D.C. have adopted Indigenous Peoples Day, either alongside or instead of Columbus Day, and the remainder do not observe it as an official day off. Even major cities have made the change: Seattle, Los Angeles, Denver, Boston, and New York City. As of 2021, NYC's school calendar now recognizes Italian Heritage Indigenous Peoples Day. In 2021, President Joe Biden became the first sitting U.S. president to proclaim Indigenous Peoples Day, while still recognizing Columbus Day federally. This marked a symbolic milestone at the highest level, acknowledging Indigenous resilience and contributions alongside the traditional narrative. The push to reframe the holiday has not been without controversy. Italian-American organizations in particular often object to the removal of Columbus's honors, seeing it as an erasure of their heritage. Columbus, though sailing for Spain, was ethnically Italian Genoese, and during the late 19th century, when Italian immigrants to America faced severe discrimination, Columbus was uplifted as an ethnic hero to foster pride and acceptance. Indeed, the first U.S. Columbus Day was proclaimed in 1892 by President Benjamin Harrison, partly as a conciliatory gesture after a horrific lynching of 11 Italian immigrants in New Orleans. Italian Americans point out that Columbus Day was one of the few national recognitions of their community's contributions. In some places, compromises have been sought. For example, the holiday in Denver, Colorado was renamed to honor Francis Xavier Cabrini, a Catholic Italian-American saint, rather than Columbus. In New York City in 2021, after debate, the school system decided to call the holiday Italian Heritage Indigenous Peoples Day to appease both sides. But the fundamental trend is clear: the Columbus myth is no longer sacrosanct. Statues of Columbus, once nearly untouchable in American civic life, have become flashpoints. In 2017, after the Charlottesville white to nationalist unrest, activists in New York and other cities called for Columbus monuments to come down, viewing him as a symbol of colonialism, slavery, and racial oppression. The following years saw several statues removed by city councils or vandalized by protesters. In 2020, amid a national reckoning on racial injustice after the murder of George Floyd, at least 33 Columbus statues were toppled or officially removed around the country. Places like Los Angeles and Columbus, Ohio, named for Columbus himself, took down prominent statues. To Indigenous activists, this was a long overdue symbolic repudiation of celebrating a man who helped catalyze the death of roughly 55 million people in the Americas from 1492 to 1600. To some critics, it went too far. They argue one should not judge a 15th century man by 21st century standards, or they fear a slippery slope of canceling historical figures. Yet the counter-argument, voiced by many Native people, is that Columbus has been mythologized precisely to obscure those 55 million deaths, and that acknowledging the truth is not erasing history, but revealing it. In Europe, the re-evaluation of Columbus has been uneven. In Spain, Columbus Cristobal Colón is somewhat less lionized individually. Spanish national pride tends to focus more on later conquistadors or on the Día de la Hispanidad, Hispanic Day, October 12th, which celebrates Spain's global cultural ties. However, Spain has its own fraught debate over colonial legacy. Some Spanish historians and conservative voices push back against what they call the leyenda negra, black legend, the narrative emphasizing Spanish cruelty in the Americas, which they claim has been exaggerated by Spain's rivals over the centuries. Books like Maria Elvira Roca Barrea's Imperiophobia y Leyenda Negra 2016 have become bestsellers in Spain by arguing that the image of Spaniards as genocidal colonizers is distorted, attributing most indigenous deaths to disease rather than deliberate slaughter. Spanish scholars such as Pablo Emilio Pérez Malena have publicly stated that calling Columbus' actions genocide is inappropriate, since they argue Columbus did not intend to exterminate an entire people and in fact needed indigenous labor to exploit. This perspective tends to view the dismantling of Columbus statues in the U.S. as hysteria or political correctness run amok, often pointing out double standards, for example, criticizing Anglo-Americans for demonizing Columbus while overlooking British colonial atrocities. On the other hand, there are Spaniards and certainly Latin Americans who support indigenous perspectives. For example, in 2019, Mexico's president wrote to Spain and the Vatican urging apologies for the conquest era, a move that Spanish authorities largely rebuffed, showing how contentious the issue remains. Italy, Columbus's birthland, has generally been slower to criticize him. Italians, as noted, incorporated Columbus into their national identity. After unification, a huge Columbus monument stands in Genoa, and Italy even made October 12 an official national day of Christopher Columbus in 2004. Italian politicians across the spectrum supported this as a celebration of Italian heritage and global exploration. In Italy's public discourse, Columbus is still often taught as the great navigator who united continents, with less emphasis on the fate of native peoples. A 2021 article observed that Italy has largely skipped the Columbus reckoning seen in the U.S., quoting Italian commentators who say he is known for being the one who discovered the Americas, and very little more. We take somewhat pride in him. We're aware of some bad things, but it's not a focus. Indeed, when statues were falling in the U.S., some Italian groups reacted defensively. In 2020, a group of Italian-American organizations even petitioned Italy's government to use schools and events to venerate Columbus's memory in defense of history and to criminalize insults to his honor. This highlights a cultural gap. In the U.S. and many Western countries, a new generation is confronting historical injustices, whereas in parts of Europe there is still resistance to revising national myths. Nevertheless, even in Europe, academic scholarship has for decades acknowledged the cruelty of colonial conquests, and public opinion is slowly catching up. The United Nations has declared August 9th as the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples and has encouraged more balanced historical remembrance worldwide. In 2019, at an event in Bolivia, Pope Francis, head of the Catholic Church, which once sanctioned the conquest, formally apologized for the Church's role in oppressing indigenous Americans during colonization. These gestures indicate a growing recognition that what began with Columbus was not simply the courageous age of discovery, but also the onset of a genocide and cultural erasure that indigenous descendants are still living with today. In American classrooms now, it's increasingly common for students to learn both sides of Columbus's voyage. They learn that Columbus was a skilled navigator who connected two worlds, and that this connection, a Columbian exchange, had profound global effects, introducing new crops and animals across continents and eventually leading to the modern Americas. But they also learned that this encounter was catastrophic for Native Americans, that disease epidemics annihilated villages, that Columbus and those who followed enslaved and killed countless indigenous people, and that calling it a discovery is a misnomer, since millions already lived in the New World. Increasingly, curriculum standards in many states call for teaching about pre-Columbian civilizations, such as the complexity of the Aztec, Maya, Inca, and Mound Builder cultures, and the perspective of the first Americans. For example, students might read excerpts from Columbus's journal and from Las Casas's brief account of the destruction of the Indies to compare viewpoints. They may discuss why Columbus Day is controversial and debate how we should commemorate historical figures. The goal of this pedagogical shift is not to villainize for its own sake, but to foster a more nuanced understanding of history, one that includes the Arawak mother on Hispaniola, as well as the Spanish sailor, the Aztec warrior as well as Cortés, the Pequot child in the wigwam as well as Captain Mason. This approach aligns with a broader trend towards inclusive history that recognizes marginalized groups. Howard Zinn encapsulated the importance of remembering these perspectives when he wrote, "To emphasize the heroism of Columbus and his successors as discoverers and navigators, and to de-emphasize their genocide, is not a technical necessity, but an ideological choice. In other words, how we portray Columbus reflects what values we choose to impart." For centuries, the story of Columbus was used to celebrate Euro-American achievements while muting the suffering of indigenous peoples, a narrative that implicitly suggested that such suffering was a deplorable but necessary price of progress. Today, a growing chorus insists that those atrocities must not be buried in footnotes. As we expand the lens of history, Columbus can be seen not only as the daring admiral, but also as the harbinger of conquest, the beginner of the history of violence and slavery in the Americas, as one historian put it. This reframing is not about assigning personal blame to individuals today, but about acknowledging truth and seeking a more honest collective memory. The legacy of Columbus, therefore, is deeply ambivalent and will likely remain so. On one hand, he undeniably inaugurated sustained contact between the hemispheres, an event that shaped the modern world. On the other hand, for the peoples he discovered, his arrival was the beginning of an apocalypse. The perspective of the Arawaks, those gentle people who ran to greet Columbus with open arms, reminds us that history looks very different depending on one's vantage point. For the Arawaks, the year 1492 was not a heroic saga but the start of their decimation. Retelling Columbus's story from their point of view restores their agency and their suffering to the narrative. It forces us to ask, what if we judge the discovery not by the old world's gain, but by the new world's loss? As we continue to discuss and teach this history, the hope is that future generations will do so with greater honesty, empathy, and a willingness to confront the full picture, heroic and tragic, of Columbus's arrival. Only by doing so can we truly learn the lessons of that encounter and ensure that the easy acceptance of atrocities that Zinn warned about is not passed on to future storytellers of our past.